Today's video is sponsored by Surfshark VPN, of whom more in a bit. We're back in the southwestern suburbs of London for a visit to New Malden. New Malden is a station on the southwestern main line out of Waterloo. It's a bit of an odd station. Many trains pass through, but relatively few stop. It has 4 platforms, but only 2 in use, and when it was first built it served nowhere. Oh, and apparently Queen Victoria didn't like it, but more on that in a bit. The line through here was opened in 1838 by the London and South Western Railway. In fact, you can see a sign from the LSWR if you stand on the Waterloo side. But New Malden dates from a little bit later. The LSWR seem to have been mainly concerned with getting their main line built, and then they filled the gaps in with stations later on. New Malden was just such a station. It opened on the 1st of December 1846. It wasn't known as New Malden back then. Actually, it must be a strong contender for the station with the largest number of name changes. On opening, it was named simply Malden. Then in 1859 it was renamed Malden and Combe. Then in 1862, Combe and Malden. Then in 1912, Malden for Combe. Then in 1955, Malden. Then in 1957, New Malden. I suspect the reason it was so hard to settle on a name was because when the station was built there wasn't much here. The Southwestern Main Line was intended to provide a direct route to the south coast, but that meant that a lot of potentially lucrative places were totally bypassed. The LSWR's solution, at least in those early days, was to build stations on the main line and name them after somewhere they wanted to serve, even if that place wasn't very near, in the hope that passengers would be fooled. Surbiton Station, for instance, was known as Kingston on opening, after Kingston upon Thames, which it's nowhere near. By the same token, Malden, or Old Malden as it's known these days, is about 2 miles from New Malden Station. New Malden is also not very near to Combe, but Combe is quite an affluent place and has been since at least the Tudor era. So again, it's the sort of place you might want to build a station at. In 1938, the Southern Railway opened a station at Old Malden, but rather than call it Old Malden or just Malden, they named it Malden Manor. Frankly, it's all very confusing, and this video would be a lot shorter if the LSWR had just been honest about where the station actually was. Hey, you know who else likes to lie about where they are? Me. That's why I'm glad that today's video is sponsored by Surfshark VPN. Wait, I should probably explain what I mean by that. There's a lot of obscure TV series and films that are available online, but not if you're in the UK. Which I don't know if you're aware, but I am. Surfshark is a VPN that hides your identity and enables you to virtually change your location while surfing the internet. With their servers in over 100 countries, I can virtually change my location and watch whatever I like. Not to mention getting around other regional restrictions and censorship, which is very useful when doing research, which is what I should be doing instead of watching obscure Slovakian cartoons. And Surfshark also gives me protection against people spying on me online. It's bad enough that governments and corporations gather people's data without them judging me for my taste in television programs. Anyway, if this sounds good to you, what I think you should do is check out the link in the description below, or scan this QR code and enter the code JGO to get 4 months extra free. Speaking of things that are excellent value for money, let's talk about how cheap New Malden Station was. The station is pretty basic. It doesn't have any big fancy buildings, just a couple of entrances on either side of the line. It's always been pretty basic, which is odd for a station large enough to have 4 platforms. I suspect that what the LSWR hoped was that the station would encourage development, which would in turn make it worth upgrading. But that never seems to have happened. It had a signal box on the middle platforms and a goods yard, but one that was located some distance from the actual station. The station did encourage development. Malden gained a second centre around the station, a new Malden, if you like. But this was something of a double-edged sword. Now the station was serving actual people who actually lived there, those people started complaining about how shabby the whole thing looked. And it seems that so shabby was the station that it was rejected by the highest in the land, none other than Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria was the first reigning monarch to travel by train, although the first royal was Queen Adelaide, for whom the London and Birmingham Railway built this special coach. That's irrelevant, I just really like that coach. Queen Victoria was the first reigning monarch to use the railways, and the London and South Western Railway were very keen on gaining her patronage. To that end, they built a special royal waiting room at their Windsor station, which is now Windsor and Eton Riverside. Victoria had a number of friends in and around Coombe, which, as I mentioned, was very affluent, so she had cause to pay the area the odd visit. The story goes that she took a look at New Malden and decided that it would absolutely not do. Possibly she also said, "We are not amused," but I don't know, none of these books specify. And instead, she would go to Norbiton. Now, I can't say for sure whether this story is true. Norbiton Station didn't open until 1869, so none of this could have happened before then. I will also say that if I were going to Coombe Hill, the bit with the fancy houses, I think I'd get off at Norbiton too, because it is closer. So the whole thing may be a tall tale to illustrate the terribleness of New Malden Station. But I got a clickbaity video title out of it, so ultimately everyone wins. In 1917, the line through here was electrified. It was the first of the London and South Western Railway's experiments in electrification. South West London had been invaded by electric trams, with the first service arriving in New Malden in 1906. The London Underground Group were also expanding at a frankly alarming rate, and so electrification was the LSWR's way of fighting back. The first lines to be electrified were those to Hounslow, Kingston, Richmond, Shepperton and Hampton Court, and 3 of those lines passed through New Malden. Well, maybe 4, depending how you look at it. In 1923, the LSWR was absorbed into the Southern Railway, who you may recall gave Old Malden its station. The Southern were big on modernisation. They not only went all out with their electrification programme, but modernised the existing railways. One move they made was to build a flyover at Wimbledon, which was completed in 1936. The consequences of this are very complicated, but long story short, it meant that just outside Wimbledon the trains could be routed in a simpler, more logical way without crossing each other's paths or getting in the way. At New Malden, this meant that all the stopping trains would now pass through platforms 1 and 4, which meant that platforms 2 and 3, the middle platforms, were mostly redundant. Aside from unusual circumstances, the only use they had was to allow staff to access the signal box, until that closed in 1968. The station was bombed on the 16th of August 1940 during the Blitz, wrecking such buildings as there were and blowing a hole in the track. A number of people were killed, though, somewhat depressingly, I can't find any details on how many and who they were. In 1959, the bridge across the High Street was replaced, resulting in one of those unusual circumstances that I mentioned earlier where the middle platforms got used. And that is the story of New Malden Station. It's not much of a story, if I'm honest, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. The station does its job, it's well served by trains from Waterloo, and while Queen Victoria may not have liked it, it certainly doesn't seem to have put the commuters off. Well, I do hope you enjoyed today's video. If so, please do leave a like and consider subscribing for more. I'd like as ever to thank my donors on Ko-fi, on Patreon, and here on YouTube for your support. You are the flyover to my complicated line. I would also like to thank Surfshark for sponsoring today's video. Click on the link in the description below to take advantage of their generous offer. And I'll see you all again very soon. Cheerio.